In order to stay as much as we can on schedule, I want to ask you to continue eating, but I want to ask our featured speaker for lunch, James Carr. He will come forward. Jim Carr is a consummate professional in the area of housing finance, and he is as his long bio in the program demonstrates, someone who's accomplished in many respects. He is, unfortunately for him, he's a graduate of Hampton University. But other than that, he's distinguished himself in many ways. As a policy and research professional, and as an active participant in issues regarding home ownership, housing finance, and particularly looking at issues of wealth ownership. Is a very recent one. He's currently a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress and distinguished scholar with the Opportunity Agenda. And so Jim will continue in this area and continue doing great things. One story I tell about Jim is that I had the good fortune of being on a program at the Treasury Department a few years ago that was looking at issues of financial literacy. And I was lucky that I spoke before Jim and did not have to compete with him. And I think you will see what I mean by that based on this presentation today. So, James Carr.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Charles and Rodney and others who put the program together today. It's an exceptional program, and I'm honored to be here to share some thoughts with you. I'm always encouraged when I come to this mic at Howard to say HU. And I know if I in any way imply that's Hampton University, I'll run out before I give my remarks. The program here, economics program in particular, is stellar, one of the best in the country. So again, it's a real honor to be asked to speak. And when I was asked to speak, the first thing that went through my head was, I've got the speech I want to give. And the name of it just popped into my head immediately. It was called Irrational Exuberance or Winner Take All. And the reason that went into my head is that I was asked right at the time that this agreement on the fiscal cliff had been signed. The stock market rose, I think, 308 points on that day, 308 points. And I couldn't help but think about Alan Greenspan's phrase, irrational exuberance. And then, you know, you look at it today, what did that fiscal cliff agreement do? It really kicked the can down the road about 2.5 months, and that's about it. There's still that big budget challenge to be faced. There's still, that whole conversation is about austerity, so that should not be anything that any of us would be happy about. That whole concept of the fiscal cliff conversation is not about creating jobs. It's not about stimulating the economy. It's about how best to cut the budget in an economy that's already struggling. And then on my way here today, I hear that the Dow just pierced the 14,000 mark. And this is happening in the same week as GDP was a minus 0.1%. And on the same day that unemployment was measured as being up 0.1%. And so, isn't that seeming like irrational exuberance? Well, not really. And I think Derek kind of alluded to this earlier. It's not irrational if, in fact, it doesn't really matter how the economy is doing in general, as long as you avoid a catastrophic turn in the economy. So if it's nothing short of catastrophic, the 1% will continue to do well. So rather than irrational exuberance or winner take all, it's rational exuberance for the winners who are taking it all. Now that's the speech I wanted to give. And I was all set to go until they said we want you to talk about the housing market. So that's the speech I have to put on pause. You see all these pages? That's the pause speech. I have to come back to that sometime later. I really, though, am, on a serious note, I'm very pleased that the conference organizers saw fit to give housing a prominent role in this conversation. Because, you know, we've heard about the foreclosure crisis, the loss of wealth, on and on and on. One of the things we haven't really focused on is the future. And so there's not a lot we can do about the past foreclosure crisis. We can't stop those foreclosures. And there's not much we're going to do about improving foreclosure mitigation activities as much as we try. They are what they are. But we can have a powerful and fundamental impact on what we do going forward. And housing really is critical. And there are a lot of people who don't really focus on housing every day and might say, well, you know, that stuff is kind of boring to me. But at the end of the day, housing has been and continues to be the #1 source of wealth for the typical American household. And for African Americans and Latinos in particular, it's a disproportionate share of our wealth. Because, for example, we have fewer sources of savings or other types of investments such as stocks and bonds, fewer real estate, investment real estate, fewer pensions, lower amounts in 401k plans, and the like. I think it was mentioned earlier, I think it was Derek who pointed out the fact that the Pew Center estimated that the loss of wealth among people of color during this crisis has been exceptional. 2/3 of the wealth of Latino households and more than half of the wealth for Asians and African Americans. But there's another way to look at that statistic, and that is, I remember when we, Charles and others, were participating in conferences about 6 years ago, and we were really having real trouble with the fact that the wealth gap between African Americans and non-Hispanic whites was 10-1. This recession has actually doubled that, such that it's now 20-1. And for Latinos, it's 18-1. And so this housing market is really essential because most of that lost wealth was housing equity. And so not really understanding where we're going with the housing market is a real problem. Now, one of the things that's interesting is if you listen to the business news, you'll hear on a regular basis economists and housing analysts saying, well, the market is now improving, you know, originations are up and house prices have stabilized, they're up in a number of markets, and so it's working itself out. I remember in 2007 hearing the same thing, that the housing market was working itself out. And you see how well that worked out. 2007 wasn't even the peak of the crisis. And so consider a few statistics. According to Realty Track, there's been nearly 12 million foreclosure filings since 2007. And although the number of foreclosure filings is going down, over 3 million households remain seriously delinquent. Further, although the number of borrowers who are underwater, meaning that the mortgage amount is greater than the value of the underlying property, although that's going down, still roughly 1/5 of all households are upside down in their mortgages. We hear about mortgage originations up, but when over 70% of the market is refinancing, that tells us something is not right with the market, because refinancing are good for the institutions that are engaged in refinancing at the time they originate that new loan, but that is not sustainable, right? There's only so much refinancing you can do. And in fact, accessing credit has rarely been more difficult, so difficult now that in fact African Americans receive more than 60% of their mortgage loans from FHA, the highest cost lender in the game. I'm going to come back to FHA later though, because FHA is an important part of the conversation for us and some issues that we need to understand, but we shouldn't be so heavily in one channel of lending. The federal government now backs more than 90% of all mortgage originations, and the Federal Reserve is buying up to $40 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities on a monthly basis. This is anything but a normal market. But if you're one of the top 1%, you're making a lot of money from it, and it doesn't really matter. One of the things that's interesting, particularly for communities of color, is the damage that's been done in those communities as reflected in vacant and abandoned properties. In fact, I was looking up home price data a couple of weeks ago, and I was amazed. 2 articles popped up at the same time in just a standard Google search. One of them showed that house price appreciation was the best last year that it had been in the last 6 years, and the second was an article that came up on Prince George's County, the wealthiest African American county in America, indicating that there were more than 51 properties listed on their foreclosure registry. The article really was focused about how these vacant and abandoned properties are frustrating existing owners who may ultimately be led to go to foreclosure simply because their neighborhood is a complete disaster, because there is no dollars to take care of those properties, put them back into productive use. They're not being maintained by the servicers, on and on and on. In short, the housing crisis is not over, particularly for communities of color. And there are no normal market forces that are going to deal with the damage that was done. And part of that damage is, how do we get back in to home ownership? Well, the private market's not going to do it. What the private market is doing right now is finding ways for investors to buy properties in communities that were solidly homeowner-occupied neighborhoods, and then create this sort of odd anomaly, which you know is not healthy for a home ownership market, which is every other property or so being an absentee investor. That's how the market is working it out, and who benefits from that? Many of the same financial experts who were part of the crisis in the beginning. So from their perspective, the market is working itself out. Time to invest in more companies. So one of the things we need to do is we need to focus on rebuilding the housing market. And as I said, I recognize while talking to you about this, some of this stuff will seem painfully boring. But I can't overstate how getting the housing market right is so important, because if we don't get that housing market right, that wealth that was lost through the Great Recession, which in only a 3-year period doubled the racial wealth gap, may be lost in perpetuity. That's not an overstatement. That is a clear understanding of what's happening with respect to access to credit, as well as the whole jobs and employment front. You add them together, and it's not looking good. Most recently, the National Council of La Raza, the Opportunity Agenda, with which I'm associated, as well as Center for American Progress, National Fair Housing Organization, and several others got together, and they put together something we call a Home for Good campaign, which had 3 prongs. One is to stem foreclosures. Second is to make sure that going forward, the housing market provides access to credit for people of color, low wealth, and low income borrowers. And third, it addresses vacant and abandoned properties. And as part of our work, we laid out 5 principles that the remaking of the housing market, and when I say remaking of the housing market, mostly what I'm talking about is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, right? So what happens to those entities going forward? What happens to them is critically important to everyone in this room. And so there are 5 things. One is it needs to, of course, provide access to credit across all geographies and across a range of housing types. I'll talk about that a little bit more. It needs to guarantee that the risks that are presented by the borrowers are taken care of or accounted for in the system itself, not resulting in taxpayer bailouts. We need to make sure that there's excessive risk-taking is internalized in the system, not just through regulation. I want to stop on that because I'm not going to talk about that again further, but it's a really important point. If I'm giving away your money, and I get paid big fees by someone else to give away your money, it doesn't matter whether you lose all your money because I'm going to get paid. It's the 1% and rational exuberance. But if I'm giving my money, that incentive structure is different. I'm going to make sure you're going to pay me back because that's my money. That's what we mean by that 3rd principle. Make sure the system doesn't encourage recklessness, not just rely on regulators to purge it. The 4th is affirmatively further fair housing and credit access. And the 5th is to employ more sophisticated measures of risk assessment, because we know that there are significant differences in the way that non-Hispanic whites, as opposed to Hispanics and African Americans, present themselves. Different risk profiles, but not necessarily worse risk profiles. So here's what happened. The Center for American Progress put together a report. It's called The $5 Trillion Question, What Should We Do with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? And they look at all the proposals that have been put forward. This is really essential to the African American community, because when you look at those proposals, most of those proposals don't even meet 3 of the standards. Inherent risk is not met by most of them. And one of the most challenging ones is that there is the duty to serve markets on the basis of fair housing, fair lending, which means to serve minority consumers, not there for most. The problem with that is that many of the proposals actually state, while creating these high hurdles for entry, that would basically preclude people with low wealth and low income from entering private channels for mortgage credit, explicitly state, well, that's okay, those people can go to FHA. And they actually propose federal policy to create a dual credit market. We know from the 1960s that dual credit markets don't work. They are inherently dysfunctional, they're a higher cost, and they are the breeding grounds for predatory behavior. So we don't want dual markets. FHA plays a critical role, and we want it, and we need it to continue. And like I said, I'm going to come back to FHA because FHA is vitally important. But we don't want to have it such that African Americans and Latinos only have access to the highest cost credit. And when we look at other things, such as the over-reliance on government agencies now, we find that more than 90% of all loans are backed by the federal government. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that there's no real focus on how to improve home ownership, particularly among disadvantaged households. You don't hear those conversations. In fact, you hear the opposite. I'm amazed. I am on panel after panel after panel where I hear economists saying, well, we've overdone home ownership. We now need to look to being a rental society. I can't resist asking, every time I hear an economist say that, are you a homeowner? Oh, yes. So what they're saying is, home ownership is good for me and my wealth. It's not good for others who haven't gotten there yet. That argument about we've expanded the bounds of home ownership to the point of collapsing the housing finance system is a ruse, and it's misinformation, and it has been so thoroughly documented and dismissed, and yet that myth still lives. It lives and lives and lives. As I said a few seconds ago, more than 90% of loans now originated are backed in some way by the federal government. And a lot of conservative voices say that that represents the fact that the federal government took over housing, pressed the bounds of home ownership, and the system collapsed. Except that the reason the federal government is doing so much backing of home ownership is because the private market collapsed and they had to step in to keep the entire economy from literally collapsing. Private lenders, prior to this crisis, had gone so far off course in their structuring and delivering predatory, reckless, irresponsible loans that in 2008, the Federal Reserve actually had to issue rules saying it's illegal to originate a loan to a person who won't pay you back, can't pay you back. I'll repeat that. They had to actually mandate to a financial firm that's got money, you can't lend to a person who you know cannot pay you back. But of course it wasn't their money they were lending. It was this whole world of confusing thing called securitization, on and on and on. But it just shows how out of whack the system got. And in fact, those rules have now been codified by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The reality of it is that, that according to the Center for Responsible Lending, less than 10% of loans, subprime loans, those were the real predatory loans that were the epicenter of the foreclosure crisis, less than 10% of them in the decade leading up to the foreclosure crisis was for first-time home ownership. Most of those loans were refinancing. You do not create a new homeowner with a refinance loan, okay? I could give you statistics for the rest of the day, such as the fact that 85% of subprime loans were securitized by Wall Street, not government. They were not covered by CRA. Only 6% were estimated to be covered by CRA. And according to the Federal Reserve in 2006, they looked at loans, subprime loans for credit scores, right? Because supposedly these were all people with really bad credit. More than 60% of the borrowers had credit histories that were sufficient enough to have potentially allowed them to take out prime loans. But that narrative, I wanted to point that out to you because that narrative is alive and well. And the argument that we've breached the bounds of home ownership are silly. Latinos and African Americans have a home ownership rate of somewhere in the mid to low 40s now, while non-Hispanic whites are still at nearly 3/4. There is a lot more room for home ownership growth among our populations, and that's where the wealth creator is, and that is the single largest wealth contributor to the racial wealth gap. Okay? The second thing one of the things we need to do with the system that goes forward is that we need to make sure that the system actually provides credit to alternative forms of housing. things like cooperatives, manufactured, small rental, 4-unit properties. These are things that people of color, low wealth, low income can actually afford to buy, but they're not well supported by the mortgage finance system today. If we're going to remake the system, they need to be. We also need to make sure that the system does something that is radically different than what is done today, which is support comprehensive community reinvestment. This comprehensive reinvestment is probably the most important and the most unique sort of element of what needs to happen. And so the Opportunity Agenda has proposed the creation of a housing and community investment bank, infrastructure bank, a housing and community infrastructure bank. The president, when he was candidate Obama, was eloquent and masterful in explaining all the reasons why investment in infrastructure as a stimulus for the economy would actually create long-term jobs and real economic growth and prosperity across race, ethnicity, income, and wealth. We support the president's proposals, and in fact he sent one to Congress just last year. He's been talking about it nonstop, and we support those large-scale $100 million and above infrastructure projects. But we also believe there needs to be an infrastructure bank that is at a more local level, that focuses on the rehabilitation and new construction of rental and owner-occupied units that are designed for community residents. And that also, as part of that redevelopment, also includes the repair of streets and roads, sewers, might also include schools, and might also include local mass transit opportunities. We believe that the dollars going out for financing of these projects should be given on the basis of the extent to which they actually create high-quality jobs. High-quality jobs mean the wages are good, maybe involve some skill training so that these jobs lead to future jobs, and that the jobs are sustainable, at least 3 to 5 years going forward. We believe with a type of infrastructure bank that I'm talking about, that is, I won't say the only way, because there are lots of proposals today to increase wealth that were, I think, really innovative. But it is one of the most sure, proven methods to help us not just get back into home ownership, but to help us begin to invest in the communities that have the highest unemployment, that have the greatest needs, and that have the greatest potential to actually take those new financing dollars, leverage them, and create economic opportunity and economic mobility. And the last thing I'll point out is, when we're looking at the housing market, it's really important to remember that as of last year, babies born in America are now majority children of color. We've been looking at Census Department now for 15 years when they first estimated that, by the year 2050, and then it's been coming down, 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 America would be majority people of color. But as of last year, the majority of babies born in this country are children of color. This is really imperative, and it's a point that we need to really drive home and make more clear to policymakers. If we have a financial system, particularly something as large as housing finance, that can incorporate the fastest growing, ultimately majority population in America, can that be long-term healthy for the U.S. financial system? It certainly won't be long-term healthy for wealth growth and economic mobility in America. So the last thing I'll point out is some people would say, well, infrastructure bank sounds good, but where would you get the money? Well, I've said all along, first of all, if you know what needs to get done and you don't say it because someone's telling you they can't find the money, that makes no sense at all. We had no money for the wars we just fought, and we spent a whole lot of it, right? If we don't say what we need, we're not going to get it. So it doesn't matter if the dollars are found. But if the crisis gets bad enough, all of a sudden people start looking at options that they didn't look at before. I'm not saying in any way that a minus 0.1% GDP is a crisis. I am saying it's not good. And the thing I'd look at is for those who say government spending can't create a job, okay, well, why did GDP drop so much? The precipitous drop in GDP was due to a precipitous drop in federal spending, right? So as policymakers are heading to the fiscal cliff, what they're really heading to is an economic cliff. Because you don't have to go over that cliff for that cliff to affect the broad middle of America. You only have to go over that cliff for it to affect the top 1%. They can go right to the edge and still do well. But for the rest, we're heading in that direction. So I would say there are lots of sources of revenue. Again, I think it was Derek who pointed it out. I'm probably attributing everyone's brilliant ideas to Derek. Thank you. I debate with Derek so much. But a financial transaction tax. Who would even see it? We're talking basis points, hundreds of a percent that could actually drive up infrastructure financing by, and remember, it's a bank. It's not a subsidy. It's a bank. But it would be able to lend on very, very favorable terms. Local communities across this country need help. That was discussed by many people on the earlier panels today. We need to ask for what we need, because one thing's for certain, the market has never taken care of itself and us. We need to make sure that the market is designed to take care of the needs and the aspirations of people of color. And when it does, it will be ultimately taking care of the needs and aspirations of the majority of America. Thank you. Yeah, let me just say one, we're going to do a couple of questions. I know we're running late, but I did want to say something about FHA, because this is another thing you really need to be aware of, because the fight around FHA will likely, could potentially be very loud and very unpleasant soon. FHA has, for the first time, it sent its financial report to Congress before the end of last year, and that report suggested that for the first time in nearly 80-year existence of FHA, it may need to draw from the federal treasury because of bad loans. It was affected by the foreclosure crisis. And immediately when that came out, even before, because there have been a lot of estimates, that private estimates, even before that came out, a lot of analysts were saying, well, there you go. See, that dysfunctional agency that disproportionately serves minorities and low-income people is going to need to a bailout from the federal government for dysfunctional lending. Well, we need to stop right there. The reason we need to stop is so many reasons. This would be a whole speech by itself. But first of all, the fact that FHA is still lending without a bailout in 2013, I think is cause for celebration of how effectively we're managing the crisis. Every one of FHA's counterparts, private lenders, major private lenders and private insurance companies, practically everyone was bailed out, shuttered, went out of business, or was purchased by someone else. FHA is still standing, and it's not a current deficit, it's a projected deficit. And it's not a bailout because it's the way the program is designed. It has a 100% federal guarantee. The fact of the matter is that FHA ran into problems with a loan that was so dysfunctional, they actually tried to eliminate this loan in 2000, more than a decade ago. It required an act of Congress to allow them to do that. That act of Congress didn't happen until 2009. So between 2007 and 2009, almost all, not almost all, but the vast majority, something like 40% of FHA's problems are one set of loans in one small period of time. And FHA is working very hard to get out. Now the problem is, as they work very hard to get out of that problem, the fees have gone up and up and up and up. That's the problem with being disproportionately represented in that market. So it's having a disproportionate impact on people of color, because effectively people of color are now bailing out FHA for its past challenges. But it's important to remember every major housing lender had some type of bailout in this environment. So the fact that FHA is projecting that it might need is something that we need to be aware of, because it's vitally important to us, particularly now. And the final thing I'll say about FHA is not like it continued to do its about 3% of the market. It actually had to ramp up in some years to accommodate almost 30% of the market. So imagine a private lender actually ramping up to do that much new business, and actually in the process having a stronger book of business than it did before. Its book of business has improved, not deteriorated. So again, I put that on your screen because you'll be hearing those conversations, but if you hear the conversations that FHA is problematic because it's another failed federal program, you can dismiss it. It's nonsense.